I'm Elle and welcome to Subject to Power. If you were a girl who was bored and bewildered by history in school, you will know where Renée Gerlich is coming from. Renée is a writer and artist based in New Zealand who decided to make sense of history in her own way, which became a beautifully illustrated series of 7 books titled Brief Complete Her Story. Renée calls it a female-centered potted history of the world, from the Big Bang to neoliberalism, and it's a great ride. Renée speaks powerfully. Please go ahead and Google her speeches. And by powerfully, I mean she offers fresh new thinking about the political and economic movements that led to our current world, and how we may use our own voices to impact our common future. In fact, she has a new book out called Out of the Fog on politics, feminism, and coming alive, published by Spinifex Press, about her own journey and realizations along the way. Enjoy the conversation. So you created a really beautiful series of 7 illustrated books called A Brief Complete Her Story that are incredibly accessible to all people, that takes us all the way from the beginning of creation of the world all the way up to the present from a female perspective. And somewhere in your books, you talk about that male history or conventional history is very hard to follow. And I relate very, very much to that. Remember being extremely bored as a child because none of it sort of seemed to relate to me or anything I knew. I've always been hungry for female historical figures or history told in a way that had some connection to me as a girl or a woman. I think it's amazing. And I just wanted to ask you, what was your impetus for creating it?
Yeah, I think that exact feeling was the impetus. So it's definitely been one of those projects where you cannot really trace the starting point. There wasn't a moment where I decided to make it. Right from the time I was in school, I was writing little notes and reading books that would help me try to cobble together some sense of a stylized kind of potted history of the world so that I could be like, okay, this is what happened. And now here I am, and this is the world. And now that means I have to do this. And it sounds very like a kind of deceptive desire. The world's not neat and tidy like that. But on the other hand, it is a desire that kind of has served me very well because it has kept me seeking answers and kept me unsatisfied with stories about the world that don't kind of satisfy that need to sort of have something that makes sense. Yeah, so I kept trying to piece something together. I studied art history and I had these scrapbooks where I would just kind of organically put pictures and notes and things I'd read and try and compile this stylized narrative of history. And it never really worked until I started reading feminist literature. And then suddenly things started to fall into place much more easily. I understood why I'd found history so confusing and bewildering and unsatisfying before that. If I was in high school or whatever and we're learning about some war, and at first, it seems like there's 2 sides and then those sides split into factions and then you can no longer figure out if anyone's right because they're all violent anyway. And from what position can you actually stand and look at what's going on and then analyze it? And I never found that position and nothing stuck. And history was just bewildering to me. But then when I realized that by knowing who I am as a woman, understanding the world to a degree as a woman, looking at history from a female perspective, it was like the magic ticket. From then it's okay, so you don't necessarily get to have a neat and tidy story, but you do get to have a stylized narrative that gives you a starting point for talking about the world we live in now and how it came to be how it is, which is what I really wanted and needed and think is important. And so, yeah, that's definitely was my motivation, just looking for an accessible history of the world that would help me make sense of how it is now.
I want to buy it for all of my young female family members and friends, like people who might be new to feminism or new to thinking about history in a different way. And especially now, not to jump ahead, but feminism is in such a precarious, there's a lot of splintering, sort of factionalizing, I feel like, in feminism that makes it difficult to breach over generations.
Absolutely. I suspect that will be a topic of its own that we might talk about. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah. And you must have done a tremendous amount of research to get all of this information sort of in a stylized manner.
Yeah, I did tons of reading, but the key to that was that the motivation transcended any particular project. So I had wanted to make sense of things since I was a kid. And as soon as I found feminism, it was like, right, it's on. So it's like, what do I need to read and where is it? And who are the authors? And I want to know all of it, like the feminist take on evolution, on the Big Bang, on all of it, because that was such a deep-seated need rather than something that I felt like I had to do for a project.
Yeah, it's funny what happens when you have a desire. So you write in book 1, Mother Earth and Sea. The process by which humans diverged from apes is called homonization, and sexual homonizations almost exclusively is the story of the human female, which I found, which we never read anywhere. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, 2 of the authors who helped me write that section of the Brief Complete History were Monica Scho, who wrote a book called The Great Cosmic Mother, and also Rachel Carson, the famous environmentalist and marine biologist. She wrote a book called The Sea Around Us. So in that book, she talks about how the sea is like a womb, and the sea is almost like amniotic fluid. It supports life. And a fish lay eggs in the sea, and they're like in a womb. And when creatures started moving onto land, they had to recreate the life-giving conditions of the sea inside of their bodies. And so the womb is like a miniature ocean. And then she looks at evolution from that perspective, so changes to reproduction, which is fascinating. When we talk about human evolution, we look at our brains got bigger and we stood upright, and we forget about the reproductive element of evolution, which is actually the central piece. Monica Scho talks about what happened to human beings. There was development of the clitoris. There was the development of the menstrual cycle. So other mammals have estrus, which means that the female bleeds when she's fertile at specific periods in the cycle of estrus. Whereas in the menstrual cycle, we bleed when we're not fertile, and we have potentially fertile at any other time, which frees up human sexuality to be about more than procreation. It's not that we're giving off hormones that we're going to need to procreate right now, but also the clitoris is the only organ that doesn't have any reproductive function, like it's only about sexual response. And we started having intercourse face-to-face rather than rear as other mammals do. So it became intimate. We were looking at each other. And then both Monica Scho and the famous spiritual teacher Osho, they both talk about how this was central in the development of human consciousness, intimate sexual experience, how this was the beginning of what we call awakening, and how there's something about that sharing of awareness and intimacy that kind of puts you inside of that paradox of seeing and being seen at the same time, and how this was a big part of human awakening. And then Osho talks about how spirituality developed out of our sexuality, that from this happening in our sexual experience, we learned that we could recreate that process of awakening without having intercourse. So human spiritual practices developed out of human sexuality. So one of the points that I make in these books is how ironic it is that one of the main premises of all the formal religions of the world is that women are somehow contaminating, or this so-called myth of feminine evil is really a big part of formal religion, and just how ironic that is, given that from this perspective, spirituality actually comes from the female sex. and changes that happen to us through the process of homonization. That's what gave us these capacities. So I think that, like, for me, that was one of the huge revelations of my reading, one of the revelations that confirmed that what this desire I had was about. Like, I think that we have these desires that don't go away. Like, I need to make sense of this. Because there's something on the other side, it's like your body's telling you, no, there's something you need to know that you're not being told here. And then when you do the reading and you make these discoveries, it's like, yes, it's like you have that confirmed. It's really magical.
Another piece of that whole thing, and which I don't know if I knew or not, was that the original calendars of history are based on the menstrual versus the moon cycle.
Yeah. Monica Shaw talks about this in The Great Cosmic Mother, a book that's not as well known, by a woman called Vajra Ma. She wrote a beautiful book with a wonderful title. It's called From a Hidden Stream, on the natural spiritual authority of women, which I think is a great subtitle too. And she talks in that book about how the earliest calendars were made by women who were just marking the lunar cycle against the menstrual cycle. And so Vajra talks about as well how this is why, like, the word mathematics, ma is one of the most universal ancient sounds that means mother. And themis is about wisdom. So she talks about mathematics is actually about the wisdom of the mothers, and how there's an etymology which connects mother and mathematics and moon. So the original maths was organic. It wasn't the maths that you learn at school that everybody knows is weird. And it's partly because it's a natural human reaction to learning facts that appear to be totally severed from real life and natural life. Well, it didn't begin that way. And I feel like a lot of the resistance kids have to how maths is taught is a natural resistance, because it's not where it comes from. It comes from a relationship between us and the world. And that's what Vajra points out when she talks about the origin of the word mathematics, wisdom of the mothers.
I find that brilliant and poetic. So book 2, you go into the matriarchy and the creation of patriarchy and how one kind of overtook the other. And I think we make the mistake often of thinking of matriarchy and patriarchy as sort of two different philosophies that are competing, but they're really completely different manner of organizations. And I wanted to sort of, if you could break that down a little bit.
Yeah. So one person who actually does that very well is Heide Gudner-Appendroth, who has this amazing book called Societies of Peace, which is an anthology of writing by Indigenous women from around the world and also some anthropologists, but the emphasis is definitely on Indigenous women writing about the cultures that they come from that are either matriarchal in some ways still or have that root, and talking about how that works and what that means for them. And in the beginning of the book, Heide Gudner-Appendroth, she talks about how people often assume that matriarchy means patriarchy in reverse, which always makes me laugh. It's like, do they really think all we really want to do is, like sell men for sex like they've done to us? Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, why would we be desperate to do that to them? That's not a drive. I don't know. I just find it kind of amusing that people would think that it was the reverse and that was what might be driving the feminists who talk about this matriarchy thing. Anyway, she talks about how the suffix archy comes from Greek and it can be interpreted in two different ways. So she says it indicates primacy, but it can be in terms of origination. It doesn't have to be in terms of domination. So when you talk about matriarchy, you're talking about basically cultures that honor the fact that we originate from women. But because we don't originate from men, the nature of patriarchy is that it must be an imposed system. It has to be imposed and insisted upon by people because we don't originate from men. So it's inherently artificial. Whereas when you refer to matriarchy, and you use that same suffix in relation to women, because it has a basis in reality, in nature, i.e. we do originate from women, It refers to a system that is a lot more both natural and logical. So the two main aspects of a matriarchal culture are that they're matrilineal and matrilocal, which means that people trace their heritage through their mother's line because they came out of their mother, and they have a birthright to live on their mother's lands. And there's nothing particularly crazy or outrageous or out there about those premises to me. I mean, I don't really see how human beings could have organized in any other way originally before we started this madness that we call civilization. Of course, we were going to trace our heritage through the mother that we came out of and have a birthright to be on the place that we were born. Like, being born into a culture where that's just honored lends itself also to honoring women, lends itself to people being able to have this kind of awe about being alive, and then cultures that reflect that state of awe rather than all the artifice that we live with in this culture, which to me originates in the original artifice, which is men owning children and us being born into male-owned. One of the biggest distortions of patriarchy is that rather than us belonging to the land because we were born on it, belonging becomes ownership in this artificial system. So men own women through marriage and own children by naming them, even though we didn't come out of them, and own the land that we live on through private property, which isn't a real thing. It's just a man-made artificial thing that we all then have to live on, and then all the rest of the artifice and the compensatory addictions that we all have because we're looking for this belonging that we ourselves have cut ourselves off from. Like, it all stems from this original severing of our natural connection to our mothers and to the land.
And so in the book, you go back to the rise of enclosures in old Europe. And I think your take and the takes of the authors that you cite are very interesting in terms of looking at enclosures as a tool to own women.
Yeah. I might actually, if you don't mind, take that as a prompt to connect us back to the present moment as well. Because more and more, if I talk about transgenderism, I have to come back to this theme of enclosure and look at it from that perspective. And I'm starting more and more to see that phenomenon of transgenderism best explained by looking at history in terms of three waves of enclosure. So Silvia Federici, she wrote a book, well, one of the books that she's written which helps to convey this idea of enclosure is called Witches, Witch Hunting and Women. So it's an extraordinarily short read and I highly recommend it. What she does in that book is she connects the enclosure movement of the Tudor period, she connects it to neoliberalism. Her work is based on looking at the way that witch hunting and misogyny is part and parcel of the package of privatization. I'm going to clarify what I mean, but one of the things that I feel is quite helpful in terms of clarifying what enclosure is and how we got to the present day is by adding on another wave, which is the creation of patriarchy. So to me, that's the original enclosure or the original structural adjustment, which is another word for neoliberalism. So then you have these three waves of enclosure. You have the creation of patriarchy approximately 5,000 years ago. You have the enclosure movement of the Tudor period, which kind of preceded what was a crucial moment in the history of colonization and in the Industrial Revolution. And then you have neoliberalism. So the first wave of enclosure, we just kind of talked about what matriarchal cultures are, how they're matrilineal, matrilocal, and people trace their heritage through the mother's line and they have a birthright to live on their mother's land. So the first, say, enclosure movement was basically the creation of the private sphere, because we used to live communally, raise children communally, and all of that to me kind of just makes sense. It's not even about what is your ideal utopian vision of how human beings should organize? No, it just makes sense that we started off like that. Like, you don't see chimps cordoning themselves off from each other with little picket fences. And, you know what I mean? Like, that's not how animals behave. So we started in something much more communal and organic. And the creation of patriarchy, so this is Gerda Lerner talks about this process in her book with that title. And she talks about how it meant changing the matrilineal system to a patrilineal system. So children are named after their fathers. And that was one of the first things that happened to establish patriarchy as we know it today. Children became named after and so owned by their fathers rather than just belonging to their mothers and being named after that fact. And then she talks about how this change kind of lends itself to the next step, which is cultures becoming patrilocal, meaning that women marry into their husband's clan and then have to move into a living arrangement with him, which makes them vulnerable to him. And also because the family around them at that point don't necessarily know them or care about them in the same way as their family does. So women are basically pulled into an isolated situation within the household. And then from here, you get eventually the creation of the state and the military and all kinds of institutions which basically function to sustain male rule because it is artificial. And also religious myths which justify the situation. So one of the most fascinating things about these myths is that they're not fabrications so much as they are distortions. So this is something as well that's really clear through the work of Maria Gimbutas, the famous feminist archaeologist who did all this archaeology in Europe and the Near East and found that, for instance, many of the goddesses that we know through the Greek pantheon are actually much older than the texts from Homer and Ovid and so forth that we're familiar with, and that they belong to symbol groups which were matriarchal. So, for instance, Athena with the owl symbol and being associated with wisdom and so forth. I used to be confused about why she was this military figure and born out of Zeus's head. You know, like, why, that's so weird. Like, I never got that. But those are later distortions. So Athena and the owl is much older, but these patriarchal traditions took those traditions and distorted them into patriarchal stories. So that's why we can still relate to many of them, because there's undertones and themes that kind of speak to the human being, but then they're twisted and also overlaid with messages about male rule that make you go, hang on, born out of his head, what? but those stories justify. We were talking about how patriarchy is artificial. Well, you need to find some story about why Zeus should be the commander of all the gods. Well, this is how. And Monica Schuh in The Great Cosmic Mother, she talks about how she's like, it must have been an awkward job, like for the original patriarchs to come up with these stories about how even though the male sex doesn't have the same capacity for the creation of life, but yet it was totally him that who created life. It was totally him. Like, this is how he did it. Come on. Like, the law is founded on patriarchal principles. It's not incidentally patriarchal. It's not just bad for women. It's founded on the premise of sustaining male rule. Andrea Dawkins has this quote where she says, the law is an instrument of religion. So you have these religious ideas that justify a particular system, and then those ideas are kind of the basis for legal codes. And so Gerda Lerner as well talks about how the earliest legal codes heavily emphasized the sexual regulation of women. Like, they were basically about marriage and property and, you know, exchanging women and what do you do if you buy a woman, you find out she's not a virgin. Like, it was all about sexual regulation of women as property. So that's the first wave of enclosure. And then in the Tudor period, like around the 1500s, during the Protestant Reformation, you have what's called the privatization of the commons. In that feudal period, people still had common lands that they could roam and use for finding edible medicinal plants and wood for construction or firewood or just roam. And yeah, so you had these common lands, which is almost unimaginable today, at least to me. And I think even when we know this very well, we can still underestimate the effects that that has on us, body, mind, and soul, not knowing where you can just go in order to be alive, like having your life conditional on expectations of society and conforming to the economy and so forth is quite inherently stressful thing for a human being. So yeah, the tragedy of the commons was when these common lands became privatized and basically taken over, I think, in large part by the textile industry, which was the first big industry in the Industrial Revolution, and they used them for sheep grazing and kicked off the peasants. And it led to this massive wave of pauperization because it happened at the same time as like the Protestant Reformation. The Tudors, they enclosed the common lands, but they also seized the church property. And the church still gave assistance to the poor at that time, and they didn't replace that with any other form of assistance or welfare. So poor people couldn't go to the common lands for the basic needs they used to be able to, for subsistence, and they didn't have assistance from the church. This is the pauperization that I think was partly allowed for the rise of the Industrial Revolution, because you have all these people who will take jobs in factories. And Silvia Federici talks about the witch craze. The witch craze didn't really kick off in England until this time. And she talks about how women were worst affected by the pauperization that resulted from the enclosure of the commons at the same time as there was no more assistance from the church. At a time when charity was no longer seen as the Protestant ethic. And she talks about how there was this important connection between the witch craze and the privatization of the commons. That correlation can be seen with neoliberalism today. So neoliberalism is another wave of privatization. What I see in this day and age is that enclosure is becoming more and more intimate. You have the enclosure of the lands in the Tudor period, of the common lands, and then through all that pauperization resulting, and that led to a working class or an underclass, like who could be employed in the factories, working in absolutely appalling conditions. So then they form a union movement. Then the union movement gets basically co-opted and turned into, rather than being premised on humanistic, anti-capitalist ideas where they see what's going on and they say no. Instead, it's been this bargaining thing of like, we just want better pay. So neoliberalism is basically this three-pronged backlash against all the progressive activity of the 19th and 20th century. And those three prongs were the rollback of rights and legal protections that workers' movements had established, defunding of healthcare, welfare and education, and the privatization of lands and public infrastructure. So what happens through it is that any government or any country that ended up in debt, often through, if there's a natural disaster or country has to rebuild after war or something like that, and they need to borrow money from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and those institutions then say, oh, we'll give you a loan, but here are the conditions, and then the country gets neoliberalized. And so that happened from the 80s. And that has come with a rise in literal witch hunting, violence against women, but also witch hunting. So Silvia Federici talks about the different countries where women are being hunted as witches these days. But obviously in the West, that witch hunting is taking place in the form of looking for TERFs and pushing us out of our jobs and so forth. And Federici makes this really important point about how she says we need to see enclosure not just as the fencing off of land, but enclosure as something much more kind of human and fundamental. One other element that helped me kind of understand this and how it works is Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she talks about how disaster is necessary for the development of capitalism, basically, part and parcel of it. So, and you can see then if you look at these waves of enclosure and if you look at it that way, the creation of patriarchy, the enclosure movement, the Protestant Reformation, and neoliberalism, you can see how these different episodes and how each of them causes so much fallout that it allows for the next round. This thing of disaster and also the trauma related to it allows for the next round and allows us to buy into all the artificial mythologies and so forth that we're going to be sold in the next round. And then at a closer level, like the disaster of the porn culture that we live in these days and the expansion of the sex trade and all the rape that comes from that leads to even more dissociation in our culture, because dissociation is part of the trauma of rape. And it's that dissociation that allows us to buy into this idea that we can have a different sex or a different gender identity from the sex of our body or whatever.
It was interesting what you said about disaster capitalism. I think that's such an important piece of this, that disaster capitalism obviously affects all people, men and women, but women do occupy a particular part in these waves that you're describing, in that they are the recipient of damage that men aren't. Obviously, porn affects women, and porn and prostitution affects women exclusively, I would say. Not that it doesn't dehumanize the buyer. It does that too, I believe. But it affects not just women in prostitution, but women, period, in the devaluation of our sexuality, devaluation of our lives, devaluation of our safety. I don't know if that's like something to jump off from, but...
So the union movement now, well, in New Zealand, they appear to have pretty much accepted prostitution, which is insane, because it's like, if rape is your primary working condition, then what is there to object to anymore? Like, you haven't got anything left to stand for, have you? Like, you've just lost the entire point of, anyway.
Human dignity, rights of any sort. Yeah.
No, you've got absolutely no rights in the workplace if you can be raped in the workplace. So you've just given up the whole movement if you do that. So it's really strange to see those kinds of things happening. But to me, it kind of, just like with the enclosure movement in the Tudor period and the pauperization, and that also led to an increase of prostitution. And it's the same thing with neoliberalism worldwide. Like, it's led to a massive increase of prostitution and trafficking, which is partly why the sex trade lobby is now so strong. Yeah, so now we're getting sold all these neoliberal ideas about sex workers' work and empowerment and blah, blah, blah. And so that basically represents the commodification of human sexuality, that form of enclosure. And then that and all the fallout from that has led to the commodification of sex itself, like our actual biology, which is now, it's like you don't have a sex, you have a gender identity, and you need to purchase all these things to express it, like green hair dye. I don't know. But, it's no longer a natural fact. It's an identity that you adopt and express through consumables.
You say something interesting. I believe it was in your Brisbane speech, where you talk about the commodification of womanhood. There's no sphere of life, there's nothing that is not able to be commodified. Womanhood itself now is for sale.
Yeah, I think one thing I talked about in that speech was kind of about the progressive assimilation of the left by the liberal establishment as well. I wish I could actually quote Silvia Federici verbatim, because she's a really good quote about this, but this principle of how enclosure is quite an intimate phenomenon that restricts our humanity and our bodies. It's an imposition on who we are as people and on our bodies. And I find it quite ironic that she says this, because some of the statements that she makes almost name the problem of transgenderism. Like, she almost just points out that transgenderism is probably the best expression of enclosure, of structural adjustment, of patriarchy, like wrapped up all in one, of all the distortions of patriarchal myths and narratives that are used to punish women at times of privatization. Like, it's all wrapped up into that one ideology, transgenderism. And she basically names it over and over again. But in her book, she says all those things about how, trans women have it worst and all that stuff. So it's like, what?
So she's not connecting the last dot.
She doesn't. No.
I cannot have a conversation with anyone untried, about what my feelings are regarding what transgenderism is, or trans extremism, or even prostitution for that matter, because it's so uncouth. My opinions are so unacceptable to your average American liberal that I risk and have lost friends and connections because of wrong speak or wrong think. And so it's really, with like-minded, we're kind of sitting, just kind of waiting, like, where would this bottom out? When will people wake up and understand the madness of it all? And sometimes I feel like it's happening, and sometimes I feel like, no, we're just going farther and farther onto this crazy, crazy ride.
Yeah. So there's kind of an implicit question about how women respond, since we're the ones who are on the receiving end of a lot of this disaster and fallout. Are we waiting for everyone just to wake up? Like, is that likely to happen? Like, what is the nature of the context that we're living in, the social context that we're living in? There's a book called The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner that really helped me navigate some of these questions. So the subtitle of the book is A Woman's Guide to Changing the Pattern of Intimate Relationships. And Lerner talks about in the beginning how in dysfunctional relationships, they tend to be based on a situation of what she calls underfunctioning and overfunctioning. So an example might be, say you have a nuclear family household, you have a husband and a wife with children, and the husband is quite absent, husband/father, which is quite normal, like maybe physically and emotionally more absent. So then what would happen is he's underfunctioning, she would then overfunction. So there's a certain amount of time and attention, for instance, that children need. There's a certain amount of emotional life that must happen in a household. So she'll find herself being more emotional, but also spending all the time with the children and giving them all the emotional attention that they need and so forth. And that's not just about her nature. That's because there's a pattern of underfunctioning and overfunctioning going on in the household. And that pattern, so Lerner talks about how her book is a guide for anyone who finds themselves in such dysfunction, but she also talks about how it's culturally patterned and how women often find themselves in the same sorts of situations and always at the bottom of some kind of hierarchy. Her book to me really, really translates into politics. Like, it can be used as a political guide as much as it can be used as a guide to change in personal relationships. And one thing she talks about is kind of how you have to go through this painful realization at some point that you can't change the other person. And this is the same actually in the political sphere. Like, this is why I'm not a reformist. I was reading the other day a book by Thich Nhat Hanh and Daniel Berrigan called The Raft is Not the Shore. And there's a line in there where Berrigan says something like, trying to extract logic from governments is like trying to get blood out of a stone. Like, it's not going to happen. They don't exist as a forum where everyone comes together and reasons out what is in the public interest. Like, that's not what a government is, and they don't exist for that. So when reformists treat governments as though that's what they are and say, you need to be reasonable about this, and here are the facts, and try and appeal to the humanity of career politicians, it's not that they don't have any, but they're not in politics for that. And that's not the role of government. So to me, Harriet Lerner talks about kind of an intimate relationship context. And say with that example that I used of the absentee father-husband, you would say, if you wanted to make an objective assessment of that situation, you would say, well, the problem is his. What's his problem? He's got the problem. He needs to step up. But what Lerner says is that the painful fact actually is that the person who has the problem, if that makes sense. The person who feels the pain and has the anger has the problem. Like, there's no real way around that. Like, he may be living a life that serves him perfectly well and he may be very happy. And if that's the case, no amount of reasoning or appealing to someone's humanity or trying to get them to change is ever going to be effective. So then shit. And like, shit. Like, you know, like what then? Because I really do believe that this is a political manual, you know, this book. So it's like, if that's the case for both in our intimate lives and in our public lives, what then? And that's kind of what the book is about. So there's two aspects. And the first one is that Lerner actually describes how people can inadvertently sort of become invested in dysfunctional patterns that occur even at their own expense. So if you take that example again of the absentee husband/father, and what would happen then when women start over-investing, like putting more emotion and more time into the family than they think that there's really fair or that they should or whatever. One thing that happens is that your identity and your sense of yourself and your life becomes wrapped up in those roles that you're playing. And Lerner is a therapist, so she's worked with people for decades, and a lot of her work is based on observing this pattern. One thing she observes is that, say in this dynamic, say the man, the husband in this scenario, really wants to do his best. And so he's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to work less. I'm going to get over my shit. I'm going to spend more time at home. I'm going to try and overcome my emotional barriers and be more emotionally available as well. So he starts to do that. The woman may discover, to her own surprise, that this is very challenging to her. She might discover that actually her sense of herself and her identity was wrapped up in being the mother, and that being her strength in the household. And also, if once the time that she'd invested into that and the emotion that she'd invested into that, if she doesn't have to invest it in those areas anymore, if some of that gets freed up, then who am I and what do I want to do with myself, with my life, with my time, can be an extraordinarily confronting question, especially given the fact that these are not just one-off scenarios. This is a lifetime of conditioning which says this is who you are in the world. And if you're suddenly given the opportunity to see yourself as more than that, it can be deeply challenging. And the nature of human beings and the human nervous system is to sustain patterns. And so we can find ourselves unconsciously being invested in sustaining dysfunctional patterns also. And that's a really important thing to recognize. It's not a blaming thing. It's not like we're doing it to ourselves. It's not what I mean. But it is a really important, I think, part of the process of transformation. I think it's something that the second wave feminists really dealt with. That second wave of feminism was so powerful because women threw off so much of that internal conditioning and changed their lives in so many ways and moved through those kinds of internal patterns. In any given situation, like whether it's like a household situation or the political landscape we're living with today, you really have to accept external reality to a degree. I can't stop transgenderism, no matter how much I oppose it, no matter how much I loathe what's happening to children in schools, how young lesbians are being convinced that their men are having their breasts removed, are having their bodies chopped into, being fed sex hormones that are changing them in all sorts of irreversible and damaging ways. I can't change that overnight. Like I can't. So to a degree, I have to accept that that is the world that we currently live in. That is the result not only of an ideology that has sprung up out of nowhere in the last several years, but it is the result of these waves of enclosure and of 5,000 years of rubbish, basically. And this is like some of the spiritual teachers I follow have this line where they say, welcome to Earth School. This is the world that we were born into. This is the nature of it. I didn't create it. I cannot change it through will, unfortunately. So I have to accept it. And then from there, you can say, well, I do have the capacity to respond. And because I only have one life, I better be pretty committed, like pretty clear about what I want my response to be, because it's a pretty sacred thing, I think, to decide on that. Acting from the heart and going, what is my response? And moving from there is a lot more important and sensible than getting locked into thinking, it's your moral responsibility to change the situation as quickly as possible. And you need to do that by convincing the other party that they need to change their behavior. That's not going to work. And so that to me is also the essential difference between radicalism and reformism. Reformism insists that the current reality is unacceptable. It has to change. Therefore, you have to change. And I'm going to tell you how you have to do it. And I'm going to keep telling you until it happens, even if I kill myself in the process. That's reformism to me. And that's what Harriet Lerner is, the pattern that she's trying to break. In Gerda Lerner's books, The Creation of Patriarchy and The Creation of Feminist Consciousness, she talks about how the very nature of patriarchy, the very nature of it, means that women have been locked into a state of negotiation for the last 5,000 years, a defensive position in which that is precisely what we do, both in the domestic sphere and in the public sphere. We're trying to tell men how we feel, appeal to their humanity, tell them what they should be doing instead of what they are doing, and then wait for that to happen. And obviously, 5,000 years, that strategy has been pretty well tried and tested. I don't think it works. And it is a really difficult to me in my own life. It's a grief process to get to the point where you go, I can't do it. I actually can't do it. I can't stop rape. I can't stop prostitution. I can't stop transgenderism. I can't. I can respond to all of those things, and not just all of those things, all of the worst things that are happening in the world, but to all of the most beautiful aspects of life. That's the other thing about responding rather than reacting, is that when you come to that place of acceptance, and acceptance not only of the external reality, but of your own capacity as an individual human being, you can start to take in the even broader picture, which is that you don't only live in a brutal world, you live in a natural world, and you're allowed to love it as well. So the response that you have comes from your whole self, like who you are, what love is to you, what is beautiful about the world, and also why that means you don't accept X, Y, Z. And here is my contribution. And then you get to see that contribution kind of have its own life. Gerda Lerner's book is basically a guide to getting unstuck from these kind of perpetual dysfunctional patterns. She does this linguistic thing where she's like, you have to accept responsibility, but not responsibility in the way that it's conventionally understood, but responsibility. So you have an ability to respond, and it's kind of like coming home to that.
So providing hope in a very unconventional manner, to me at least, counterintuitive, where it essentially tells you to stop fighting, or at least negotiating, or spending your energies on a futile effort, and turn towards your own creativity, which is so much more powerful than anything, really, anyway.
Yeah, actually, I have something else to say about this, which is, for me, really the only thing that can allow for social transformation is not persuasion or negotiation, but pressure, like groups that are big and strong enough to exert pressure on the social environment. And I believe that the only way that you can create such a movement is by investing it with women's love and creativity, by having movements in which women really see themselves reflected in a way that we don't anywhere else. And I think that this idea of responsibility rather than reactivity or negotiation, let's say we build a women's movement which is based on women's creative responses to the world we live in today. Try and stop that movement. Like, I'm not talking about concession and surrender in the sense of capitulation. I'm just saying that I think that if we start defining who we are and what kind of contributions we want to make in the world on our own terms, rather than thinking that we have to constantly react to the news cycle, or, you know, Will Smith just punched someone at the Oscars, so now we all have to talk about whether he was defending his wife or whether he was ignoring her or whether it was toxic masculinity. Like, you don't have to talk about it at all. You can just ignore it and continue to work on what is your contribution to the world. That is the kind of movement that I think is the only kind of movement that can actually create social transformation that's both lasting and deeply meaningful. So, yeah, I'm definitely not arguing for any kind of political capitulation, just to make that clear.
It does bring up something else in your book called, I think it's book 6, The Resistance, where you discuss women and men who find themselves in liberation movements, where women, even there, become, I think you call it helpers. They find themselves in a second class position, even so. And so I think that's kind of the logical place where we find ourselves when we negotiate and react rather than try to forge our own path.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I see it as well. And yeah, basically women are socialized into a position where we are helpmates. And if we want anything for ourselves, we have to negotiate with the man who is in charge. And that's the position that we've been put in on the left as well. We do have to be wary of creating a movement in which we put ourselves in that position again, even when there's no men around to tell us to do it. But I feel like it's natural that that happens because that's the nature of patterns and that's the nature of socialization, that if you're socialized to conform to a particular mode of living, even when you start to politicize or you start to be able to analyze that and see that you are conditioned, it doesn't automatically break the pattern. It still takes time and effort and conscious work to change those patterns. So I do think that it's quite natural that at least pockets of feminist movement would be based on negotiating with oppressive systems or with men, or because that's how we're socialized. So that's going to come out politically as well. There's a saying about how small groups of passionate women could change the world. I believe that. But so far they haven't stopped the possibility of nuclear war. And none of my heroes through history that I talk about in this brief complete history series, so many women who I admire and who pulled out all the stops, reached as deep as you possibly can and spoke in the most wonderful, affirming, powerful ways and gave everything, like Rosa Luxemburg, whose voice was just powerful and so stirring. And she was murdered for her work. She didn't stop the war. She didn't stop capitalism as she intended. That was what her work was about. Does that mean she failed? I don't think so, because I can still hear her voice. I feel like one thing that happens when you go into this idea of responsibility, when you concede external reality and you go, okay, I can't change that, then you really have to ask yourself, who am I? Who am I really? And I feel like that's a question that a lot of the people whose voices you can hear through history really ask themselves. The women who were burned at the stake for writing feminist mystical texts in the Middle Ages, where did they get the strength and the energy to do that? Where did Rosa Luxemburg get the strength? Where did Emma Goldman? Where did those women get the energy to go through imprisonment and hunger strikes and forced feeding and all of that? Because they knew that who they are is something more than this current manifestation. And I think that sense is proven by the fact that their voices echo through history and that they are still heard now. I feel like when we concede that we can't stop this wave and we concede that we only can respond, and that forces us to dig really deep and go, well, who is responding then? Who am I? And what then do I have to say? That's a powerful thing regardless of what happens. And I think that has to be enough for us. I don't think that we can afford to make changing the external world a condition for us to act. I don't think we have to make winning the fight a condition for us to act. None of my heroes of history won any struggle in any definitive sense. And that wasn't a condition for them to act. They acted because they knew that they felt something more than who they were. They channeled something. I'm sure everyone in the world wants to have an answer as to how to stop the possibility of nuclear war and how to get teenagers off the surgeon's table and how to end the rape epidemic and everything. But we only have this one human and this one response. And I think all that we can do is try and tap into that and channel that to the best of our ability. And I think that that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to jump to something else. I don't know if you have been impacted by Me Too or if you have felt the impact of Me Too. I did very much.
Yeah, I do have a slightly different take on that movement, but I think you saying that it affected you very much, that's completely, I think that's the normal, natural, yes, so should it have. I felt myself more distanced from it, but it might have been like where I was at the time. And I feel I wasn't necessarily in a position to be affected by it, really. But one thing, I have a book coming out this year with Spinifex Press called Out of the Fog. And I actually talk about this in that book. The book talks about all of the different kind of social movements that have popped up since the Occupy movement in 2011. Black Lives Matter, the Pride parades, and then, of course, Trump was elected. You had the women's marches, there was Me Too, and then the climate strikes. And there's also been March for Our Lives, which was for gun control in the United States. So there's been all these kind of mass movements or apparent mass movements that have been taking place in rather quick succession over the last 10 years. As someone who writes about, as a radical feminist and who particularly writes about transgenderism and who has experienced the way that that makes me persona non grata within the left, it's been a rather interesting juxtaposition to notice that all of these mass movements coming up at the same time as particular women are basically not allowed to take part. And so I've been asking myself, how do I understand this correlation between we're basically not allowed to talk about the nature of power. We're not allowed to talk about the deep patriarchal roots of these structures at the same time as we're being given the impression that all these grassroots movements are suddenly arising. Like Me Too, for instance, is quite big on university campuses, the same university campuses where postmodernists are proclaiming that women basically don't exist. And is there a relationship between the fact that we're allowed to have now a movement, a women's movement, a public women's movement that even the media will talk about, at the same time as the rug gets pulled out of from under that movement? So to me, Me Too almost looks similar to the consciousness raising of the second wave. It was a bunch of women taking experiences that they had had individually and that they might have felt alienated by and isolated by, and sharing them so that other women would be like, me too, me too. So you start to see a pattern. And the power of the second wave was that those patterns were turned into analysis. So feminism to me is not an ideology because it isn't based on any ideological premise. It's based on experiences, forming patterns, shaping analysis, which can change if the patterns change. There's no rigid underlying thing that can't be subjected to reason, or, you know what I mean? Experiences form patterns, form analysis. So if we're living in a climate where it's basically been precluded that these patterns are allowed to create analysis, you're not allowed to have radical feminist analysis, but you're all allowed to talk about your sexual abuse on the internet, which also happens to be absolutely teeming with pornography, and there seems to be a demand for accounts of sexual abuse on the internet because there's a big part of what the internet is. So women are allowed to go on there and give their accounts, but we're not allowed to have an analysis which would allow us to do anything about it. I just do find that somewhat suspect that at the very same time as women are not allowed to have analysis, we are allowed to all talk about our abuse on the internet, when the internet has a hunger, it seems, for these kinds of records of abuse, which is what porn is as well. I know that Me Too had a very powerful effect on many women, and I can't really speak to that because my own response was to think about this disconnect. But of course, had I not been reading feminist literature like a crazy person at the time, because I was like deep in it at the time of Me Too. If I wasn't, it might have been my first introduction into consciousness raising, into like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone, and look at this. Like it could have had a very different effect on me. I'm not entirely sure what it represents to me, but I do find this discrepancy interesting, and I feel like it exists across the spectrum of political movements that we've seen pop up. For instance, the climate change movement. You hardly ever hear them talk about militarism. And it's a real glaring omission. So it's like, okay, so recently I went to this grocery store and I had my bike helmet on. So they offered me a free bag which says, say no to short car trips or something like that. And I was like, oh, no, thank you, because I don't really want to walk around with a big thing on my back telling people what they should do. And I had this sense that because of feminine socialization, it tends to be women who take on these kind of moral imperatives more. So it ends up being the woman who needs to pick up her kids from school, do the groceries, like feeling guilty because she's getting in the car, when the reality is that the United States military is the biggest contributor to fossil fuel emissions on the planet, and no one's talking about it. Like, I just, you know what I mean? So then I'm like, well, what is this climate change movement really about? Is it just exists to make women feel guilty for existing? But I know that that is one massive, massive result of it. I totally know that that is, that so many women, they don't want to consume plastic and they don't want to buy in organic foods. And they also don't want to be the snob that goes to the organic store because they know that that's not the solution to a global problem, blah, blah, blah. Like so many women, they can't move because of how bad they feel about climate change.
I think that makes your reasoning come full circle. Exactly that, where women are, you know, here's this global problem that's man-made literally. And it all kind of falls on top of women's heads to navigate in this like cage of guilt and feeling terrible that we live in such a degraded world. And yet we take it in and take it upon ourselves to sort of negotiate this little cage that we've been put in through no action of our own. I think it's just like the perfect sort of end.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to say about your book?
So the title, Out of the Fog, refers to how I grew up, the sense of being inside of a fog, and trying to get out of it has been a big, just that's been my life. Like, how do I get out of the fog? The political landscape is a big part of what that fog is and what compounds it. And I see the way that people are being moved from one political issue to the next at the moment, like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, climate change, and all of them have these high stakes imperatives attached to them, but they actually all don't necessarily agree. So Black Lives Matter, prison abolition is part of that. The state is racist. But then with the Me Too movement, we need to put rapists in jail. And then with the climate change, you know, again, they all have objectives that don't necessarily reconcile very easily. So I think that leads to a lot of fog and confusion as well. So my book is addressed to people who feel really bewildered and guilty and shamed, but powerless to kind of figure out what to do about this bombardment of issues and so forth. And I try to use feminism, radical feminism, which is a very grounded form of feminism, not the airy-fairy stuff that people normally think of when they think of feminism these days. I use it to show how it can really clarify the nature of politics and how it can then also help us to figure out how we want to respond to the world. Yeah, so talk about that theme as well of response rather than reaction, and basically conceding external reality without capitulating.
Well, thank you, Renée, so much for talking to me for 2 hours.
Thank you so much. Very good to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe from wherever you get your podcasts. I would love to hear your thoughts and comments, so please drop a note on the website, or even better, take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, Elle. Audio engineering by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and the music is by Beware of Darkness.